Welcome back, everybody. We have Jack with us, who's actually going to be doing something incredibly different. Instead of having a predetermined lecture and panel, he's actually going to be building one live with you guys as viewers. So if you have questions after each segment, he's going to ask for them so you guys can, get exact on the spot type of Q&A. And I somehow got roped into staying here with him, so you guys get a whole hour of me.
All right. Hello, everybody. As you can tell from this riveting start of a presentation, today won't be on PowerPoint, but it will be on Excel. I've decided to make today a bit of a Finance 101 class, and we're going to the number one question we're going to try to answer today is, how do valuations work? Like, what underpins valuations? And then if we have time, we'll build up a studio's revenue, and then we'll build up a studio's expenses, and then we'll value a studio live together. If you're in the comments, in the chat, send me your questions. I will either answer them as we go along or try to answer them at the end of each section. We have an hour today. So by the end of this hour, you should understand the theory behind valuations, and you should understand what someone means when they say EV to EBITDA, or, this was sold at 8 times multiple. What does that mean? Most people don't know. They just know, I want 10x, I want 7x, I want 5x. Today, we're going to answer what it means. So the very first basic concept we're going to learn is the time value of money. The time of value of money answers. Oh, sorry, Ash, am I good to go?
Yeah, you are good to go.
Awesome. So the time value of money answers a very simple question. And Ash, I know I've asked you this already once before, but would you have $100 today or $100 a year from now?
I'm gonna have to stick with the answer I gave you before during the podcast. It would really depend. It would depend on my financial needs of today. If I was financially in a pinch, I would want that $100 today.
And if you weren't?
I would probably take it in the long run then, especially if there was interest or something attached.
Okay, so we're touching on an interesting idea, right? Which is the idea of compound interest. So our friend Einstein has said compound interest is the 8th wonder of the world. He understands it, earns it. He who doesn't, pay it. In simpler terms, the long-term average return for the S&P 500 is 10.5%. Okay? So what that means is that if I invested this $100 that I got today in the S&P 500, a year from now, I would have 110. So what that means is that in almost every case, well, not almost every case, in every single case ever, you should prefer $100 today instead of $100 a year from now. Because in case one, you end up with 200. And in case two, you end up with 210. So, chat, if ever any of this is unclear, just let me know. Otherwise, I'll keep plowing on. So what this means also is, let's say I told you could have $100 every year for the next 5 years. If you took $100 today and kept investing it, after a year, you'd have 110. After 3 years, you'd have, after 3 years, you'd have 120, after 4, 130, and after 5 years, 150. This is a very important concept, right? This concept is called the time value of money. So, in essence, I would rather have $100 today than in a year from now. Or I would feel the same if you gave me $100 today or $110 a year from now. I'd be equally happy. because I could take the $100 and invest it, and I would get 110, or you could just give me 110. Big deal, we're equal. That concept runs in reverse as well, which means if my rate of return is 10%, and you told me, how much should I give you today for you to feel equivalent about getting $120 a year from now? So you would take your 120 and divide it by your rate of return, and the answer would be 110. If you gave me $110 today, I would be just as happy as getting 120 a year from now. Or 109, really. Okay, so this concept of bringing money forwards and bringing money backwards is called the time value of money. Okay, because I can, and here you see, I could give you $100 every year, and you would end up with 500. Or if you had $100 you were reinvesting every year, you would get 610. And this is why someone who understands compounding earns it. Someone who doesn't understand it pays it, because you would have lost out on 110 additional dollars at the end of 5 years. All right, cool story, bro. Why are you telling me all this? Well, because a business, so the other thing you could do is you could say, all right, well, how much is a stream of cash flows worth? Let's say I could get $10 a year for the next 5 years. Okay, same concept as before. How much would each of these cash flows be worth to me today? So you would do 10 over 1 plus our rate of return to the exponent of the number of time this has passed. Okay, this is a pretty common formula. This is the formula for the time value of money. And so we say, okay, if you gave me $10 a year from now, I'd like $9 today. $10 2 years from now, I'd like $8 today. $10 3 years from now, well, give me $7.50 today. And $10 5 years from now, I'd much rather take $6.21 because I could invest them. And if I did that, I would get $10. Hopefully everybody's with me so far. Okay, so what we're saying is, this is the present value of each cash flow. If we do the sum of these cash flows, we get a very interesting number, $37, which means you could give me $10 every year, which would be $50, or you could give me $37 today, and I'd be equally happy. So why am I telling you all of this? Or actually, sorry, Ash, should we pause here to see if people have questions?
Yeah, if anybody has questions, feel free to pop them in chat. I forgot to get your banner going. Anyways, I'm all messed up today now. Yeah, guys, so this is going to be completely interactive, so we're not going to save our stuff to the end. So as you have a question that pops up, please feel free to ask it. And if not, we can just move on.
All right, let's continue. Now, why is this interesting? Is because these cash flow can represent something else, revenues and expenses, right? So let's say we have a business that's making $10 a year over the next 5 years only, and they pay their employees $7. All right, I need to fix the formatting or it's going to bother me deeply. Okay, so this business pays their revenues $7 a year. Fantastic. That means that it generates a cash flow of $3 a year. Fantastic. So now your business, and we could multiply this by 1,000, so it's a $10,000 a year or $10 million a year, whatever. Business, it's spent $7 million on their products. That means they're making $3 million a year. Okay, maybe this is a business generating back catalog, for example, that has a 30% margin. Cash flow we could use for now EBITDA as well. And all of a sudden, hopefully people are going to start to recognize where I'm going with this. This business has a 30% EBITDA margin. So what we're saying is, okay, what is the present value of each of the cash flows? So I take this 3 million and I use my 10% return, which is what the S&P 500 makes in the long run, and I bring it back by the number of periods it's in each. And what we're saying is that a $3 of EBITDA in year one is worth $2.7 to me, 2.5 in year two, 2.3, etc., in the following years. Jay says, go back and explain what EBITDA actually is. All right, good point. EBITDA is earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization. This number is used as a proxy for cash flow. So in most cases, well, cash flow before interest. We won't go into all of that, but what you really have to know is that EBITDA basically equals cash flow. So if you, and it's obviously it's a rule of thumb, but if you say like my business generates 5 million of EBITDA every year, that means, rule of thumb, lots and lots of caveats, but basically you have 5 million in cash hitting your bank account every year. That's what it means. And so really this would be free cash flow, because there's a whole bunch of other stuff we won't get into, but it doesn't matter. Okay, let's just call this cash flow. So present value of each of these cash flows is this much. And the sum of the present value is 11 million. So what we've learned here is that a business generating $3 million a year would, to someone who was investing in the stock market, be worth 11.4 million. Now we're going to see something very interesting, which is, let's say this is a game studio. Game studios are a lot more risky than the big companies that make up the S&P 500. A lot more risky. So maybe instead of 10% return, I want more. I might want a 15% return on my money. And what has just happened is you'll see that the sum of the present value changes. So in this case, someone who only wants a 10% return on their investment, they would pay $11 million for the business, $11.4 million for the business. Whereas someone who sees or views the business as riskier would only pay $10 million. In reality, a video game investment is probably a 20% return because it's much riskier. So that's what I would look for, which means that I would only pay $9 million for this business. And it actually touches on a really interesting concept, which is that despite all the science behind valuations, in many ways, value is in the eye of the beholder. There are concepts like the WACC, which is the weighted average cost of capital, which takes a blended amount of debt and equity, et cetera, to determine what the right number for a particular business in an industry is. Personally, I think it's BS. I think anybody investing in a video gaming company looks for at least 20%. If it's a large video gaming company, maybe they'll look for 15%. And if you're a video gaming company that you're at the paper pitch stage, 25%, it's your first game, 30%. And you see how the present value of the company is reflected by the increased risk. I'm going to let that concept sit for a second, which is that despite the same mechanisms, more risk means we pay less for the money up front. So hopefully that's clear for everyone. Okay. So now we've determined that for a company that is generating $3 million a year over the next 5 years, someone in video games is probably willing to pay $9 million today. Great. This sum of the present value is also called enterprise value. And this cash flow is sometimes called EBITDA, as we talked about earlier. Now, why is this interesting? Because when people talk about multiples, they talk about EV to EBITDA. And that means enterprise value, the present value of the sum of our cash flows, it's actually the sum of the present value of our cash flows divided by our EBITDA, aka proxy for cash flow. So in this case, our EV is 9 and our EBITDA is 3. So what this is saying is that this particular business, who only generates money for the next 5 years and who is quite risky because it's trading at a 20% discount rate, would only generate a 3x EBITDA. Now, it's actually amazing to me because in 20 minutes, we've gotten to the crux of the talk, which is what the hell is EV to EBITDA? This is what the hell it is. It's the present value of the sum of your cash flows divided by your cash flow in year one. So this is a 3x business. Now, if we want to have fun with it, we could say, all right, well, what if our margin was better or worse? So we're going to make this an input. And this an output. So if this business were to, for some reason, have a high EBITDA margin that went down over time, it would be worth $11 million. And so you say, okay, that's more money, but why is the multiple less? Well, it's because your year one EBITDA is high. But presumably the risk would be lower. Maybe much lower. Not really. Or what would happen if your margin went up in later years? So what we had here was 50, 40, 30, 30. What if we have 30, 30, 40, 50? You notice this number is not as high. The reason is that these cash flows happen later on in the year, and so they're discounted, and you get less impact for it. So there's something missing here, right? Which is most businesses don't just stop after 5 years. They continue. And so typically what we'll say is a business like this one that's generating 3 million EBITDA a year might. So it's kind of circular, but basically what we say, okay, let's say this keeps growing this business will grow to 3% forever. So actually let's juice this a little bit and let's say there's growth in the business. It's growing 5% a year. Then we say, okay, it's going to keep growing at 5% a year, or maybe 3% a year. And we're going to assume it grows into infinity. That means that for the rest of its life, forever, this business is going to generate 25 million. So in 6 years, I would pay 8.4 million for the rest of this business's cash flows, which is just a lump sum. And so we drag this out. And now we get 6 times EBITDA, which if you're a business person, this will be a much more intuitive number. So what was happening earlier is we were only valuing 5 years of earnings. But by adding year 6, which is really called the terminal value, we've decided to capture all of this business's growth. So we say it's going to grow at 3% a year until infinity. And now you end up with an EV to EBITDA of 6. So how does a newer studio estimate what level of return an investor will want based on their experience? I think you could say 20 to 25%. The newer you are, the higher the number. That's why I was saying earlier, like people talk about WACC, they talk about the long-term return of the S&P 500. You're way riskier than that. So now we could actually apply this. I mean, I could pause quickly for questions here. And then we'll move on to how do we apply this.
I actually have a question.
Yeah, please hit me.
So if a new studio they're stuck at a 20-25% risk.
Yeah.
What are some steps they can take to minimize that risk, to look like a less risky, even if they are like a brand new? Is there anything they can do to minimize?
The answer is like intuitively correct. Will be intuitively correct to you or to anybody who's in publishing. Build a community, have a vertical slice that's fun and playable and good. Have a really strong team, have a really clear production plan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So like most of the gaming community today is complaining about, all these publishers want all these different things. It's because what underpins the rate of return are concerns like there's increased risk. Inflation is higher, right? So my real rate of return, let's say the inflation was 1%, my real rate of return is 24% a year. But with inflation at 5%, my real rate of return is 20%. Now, what's actually going to happen is I'm just going to increase this to 30, and I'm going to bid lower. In fact, this right here is a short demonstration of why inflation hurts valuation. It's for exactly this reason. So yeah, you can take steps to reduce your risk, and there's steps that everybody will tell you to do anyways because they're going to help you get a publishing contract. They help you get a publishing contract because you're now a less risky investment. Right? So let's talk about revenues. How do we build this line of the P&L? We use this back of the envelope break-even calculator. And by we, I mean me. I did it once on a call, and I don't think anybody else at AGP uses it. But basically, how it works is anytime someone pitches me a game, like this is what I'm filling out either in the back of my mind or live. I go, okay, your game budget is $2.5 million. Sick. You probably need a 15% bonus in marketing. So the total budget is $2.8 million. This game will probably sell for $30. Now you have your chargebacks, your tax, your refunds, the cut that Steam takes, and the fact that you'll be taking sales, which means that on the $30, you're really only getting $14 per unit. That means you need to sell 200,000 units in order to just break even. Okay, this is before we even talk about publishers, etc. $200,000, that's actually pretty reasonable. I mean, 200,000 units for most games in this price bracket, assuming it's a good game, I think that's a reasonable number of units. Okay, great. So let's say you have a game. Oh, my computer's frozen. Let's say you have a game, which we're going to call Project Bananas. Ash, do you want to come up with a different name?
I'm here for Project Bananas.
Yeah, I think we're all bananas for bananas. So let's talk about Project Bananas. Project Bananas is what kind of game should this be?
Let it be something cool. Okay. I don't know.
Project Bananas is a cool project. And it sells for
a shooter and you shoot people with bananas.
Perfect. Banana peeling simulation game. Perfect.
That's better than mine. Thank you, Cyber.
So we quickly talked about the adjustment factor of 48%. This is the buildup. This is how I get it. And so that means the studio receives, assuming no publishing deal, $14 per copy. Okay. Now, because it's a simulation game and not a clicker game, we think it'll sell maybe this will sell, I don't know, 350,000 copies. Okay, it's a premium PC console premium game. Most PC console games will sell the bulk of their sales in year one. In year two, they might sell an additional 30%. In year three, they'll sell an additional 20%. And let's say year four, they will sell 10% of the original amount every year. This is rough. This is like a rough estimate. But what this enables us to do is say this. The colors are very important. So we're going to sell 350,000 copies in total, of which 60% is in year one. Actually, here, this will just make my life easier. So we're going to sell 60% in year one, 30% in year two, and 10% onwards. Great. These are the revenues for our studio. Oh, copies sold times the amount of cash you actually receive, of course. Something has gone horribly wrong. Right. Now we have a revenue forecast for our studio. Fantastic. But as we all know, this is not how things usually work. Oh, wow. As this can also use rev share not promotion if I know the projection.
We actually have a question from Kevin if we want to pause.
Kevin, as an outsource provider, can I also use this to estimate how much rev share and upfront I should negotiate if I know their projected sales? By rev share, I assume you mean percentage? This is not sufficiently interactive. I will say yes. You can use these rules of thumb to, yeah.
Kevin says yes.
Yes. You can estimate, you can use this to estimate how much you should negotiate for. It'll give you an idea of what the project will do. The thing is that projected sales are very much an art more than a science. That's why publishers have scouts. That's why 6 scouts will say no and 2 will literally battle to the death over each other to sign your game, etc. But yes, you can use this as part of your negotiating arsenal. So we talked about the time value of money. And so we could say, all right, well, these are the revenues. Let's say my rate of return is 20%. What is the value of these cash flows to me? And then let's just say for our, make this example easy, that this game is not going to sell any more copies afterwards. So a studio that were to perform this way, if we were to sell them today, would be worth about $4.5 million. Great. Except if we were to say, well, actually, no, now we have this game performed relatively well. We have a value of an IP. The IP is worth something. Maybe this IP actually continues to sell for a while, right? So we do this times over our rate of return minus inflation at 5%. We'll call the long-term value of the studio. Maybe if you were to keep the studio for years and years and years, it would create an additional $2.5 million, which today you would only pay $700,000 for. So now the total value of your studio becomes $5.5 million, including the value of the IP. And you're like, all right, that's pretty good. I came out with a game that I sold for $30 MSRP. I sold $350,000, 350,000 units. I'm worth $5.5 million. Like, yeah, you'd feel pretty good about yourself. Except here we only have the revenues. So let's talk about expenses. Watching the clock, I'm going to keep expenses like simple for now. All right. Let's say the dev budget is for a game that sold 350,000 units. Let's say the dev budget was $1 million. So year 1 you spent 250. Year 2 you spent 750. Now, actually, I want to make this point very clear. We talked about the time value of money earlier, but we're going to talk about it again now. Okay. So what happens if these cash flows happen later? Let's say they start in year 3. What happens to the time value of money? So right now it's linked to year 1. If I move these cash flows over by 2 years, the value of my firm drops by $1.5 million. Now, can anybody in the chat tell me why?
Come on, smarty pants in the chat.
It's okay. The reason is the time value of money, because the money compounds, right? So I could get if I were to get $3 million in 3 years, I'd be just as happy getting $1.7 million today. So I could have $1.7 million today or $3 million in 3 years. I'd be just as happy. In this example, though, I'm getting that money right away. In this example, I'm getting that money right away, right? So it doesn't have to compound for as long. So to get $3 million in a year from now, I'd be just as happy with $2.5 million today. In 3 years, I'd be just as happy with $1.7 million today. And that's a very important concept because, I deleted our expenses tab, no problem. Because we're about to talk about expenses. So this is the revenues, which we shall now rename to cash flow. Or, we could just keep this here. So now we have to talk about expenses, okay? So we have our revenues and expenses. So let's say we said this game took $1 million to make. We spent $500,000 in the first year, $1.5 million in the second year. We had a fantastic release, and we started making revenue at this point. And let's just say we went to a, what do you call it, bone stock, skeleton crew for the studio long term. Maybe we're only running with $150,000 in expenses per year. Throw on this back catalog, it's now become a lifestyle business. Great. This is what the cash flows for the business look like. Year 1, you lost $500,000. Year 2, you lost $1.5 million. Year 3, you brought in this much, etc. At our high risk rate of return of 20%. The firm would be worth there's a mistake. Oh, that's why. I didn't think of that. There we go. 5.5 million. Now, why does that make sense? Oh, I see. Okay, yes, there were many mistakes. There we go. This is intuitively way more correct. So the firm is actually only worth $2 million. Yes, cyber. I'm sorry, but this is Finance 101. If you have a specific question, I'd be happy to answer them. I love Alt ESV for values. The streaming transfers is Alt ESV. I actually don't even do it on purpose. Alt HVST. I don't even know how to do it now. Oh yeah, Alt HVT. It's Alt HVT bingo card. Okay.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Now, does this apply to a slow burn game? So it doesn't do terribly. We'll use Among Us, for example.
Yeah.
wasn't a huge hit there for a while, but then it exploded because of the pandemic. So would this also apply to a game that would be a slow burn that turned into like an overnight sensation?
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
Why don't we put that in? Let's say it turned into an overnight sensation and made 10 million. So how many years later did it turn into an overnight sensation, do you want to say?
I think it was like 2-3 years. I could be wrong, but I know it had like a grace period of just being a slow burn.
Yeah. So here, what we could do is we'll say this is a made-up studio. The game is already out, right? So it was making 100,000 a year for 2 years, and then all of a sudden, it made 1.5 million, 5 million, and then it made 5 million thereafter. That firm would be worth 8.5. Well, actually, it would be worth more because you would do this times. It'd be worth 16.5 million.
Now, do these figures change if, like, we'll use Xbox Game Pass, for instance? Say your game is acquired to be placed on Game Pass. How would that reflect or
let's use this template. Okay, so we have revenues. Let's call these game sales. And let's call these one-off events. And we'll say cash flows is sum because that's properly modeled. Perfect. So you're saying, okay, what if we got a Game Pass deal that didn't cannibalize our sales in any way? Let's say the Game Pass deal was $1 million. That would increase the value of your firm by around 600,000. If the Game Pass deal was 3 years from now.
Interesting.
Okay, so yes, Brian, you do. That's why we're doing a premium PC console deal, just to keep things simple. Because what I'm trying to teach here is like the theory, the time value of money, and how this influences valuations. But to your point, if there was a DLC, so if your Skeleton Crew managed to release a DLC, it would increase the value of your firm by that much. And that's why this works. And then there was another question. So basically, studio expenses were 1 million. They made 5 million over a long time, but they're only worth 2 million at present day. Yes, because this is how much I would pay today in order to acquire this stream of cash flows.
That's kind of a slap in the face, man.
Well, yeah.
You do all that work, have all that money, and then basically just watch it trickle down to nothing. Which, I mean, 2 million is not nothing, but
also, Ash, remember, this is before we've even taken into account the publisher cut.
Jeez.
But, I mean, look, most people don't think they're only going to sell 350,000 copies, right? They think they're going to do a lot better. So maybe we see, okay, you know what? This could be interesting. So let's call this 350K. What about 500K? That's an extra, okay, so 350K. Let's say we did 450K. That extra 100,000 units is worth $1 million to your valuation. The extra 150,000 units is worth 1.5 million to your valuation. And it scales very quickly afterwards. In part because it grows this number here, which is a proxy for the value of your franchise.
So what if Project Bananas, 'cause, our fictional game, what if Project Bananas was an absolute flop, but was considered a low risk? So they had a really good percentage on the risk, but it was an absolute flop. But then, it gets kind of taken over down the line as like a cult classic-y type deal where people are now interested in something that flopped. What would our projection be like then? I'm trying to throw stuff at you.
Sick. All right. So look, let's say it was a flop in the sense that it barely broke even. It sold 150,000 copies. Do we think that's enough for a flop, or should it be more of a flop?
Let's make it to where you're not cutting even close to you are just bleeding money. It's a absolute flop.
Okay. So basically, if it was, let's say I sold 50,000 copies, all right? Or okay, no, we want to. Yeah, this looks like bleeding money, right? You're on a skeleton crew of 150K. You're not doing well. You broke even the first year, and now it's just doom and gloom in the future, right? So you'd have to pay me $1.4 million to take on the studio, as it is. Okay. But what you're saying is, all right, well, what happens if, a few years from now, all of a sudden the game sales just go bananas?
No pun intended.
Absolutely intended. Well, then it would be worth 12 million. If 6 years down the line, suddenly you exploded. And here, look, we're generating an incremental 28 million in sales. The crazy thing is that even with that extra 28 million in sales, you're still only worth 11 million today.
I mean, honestly, I think I would be okay with only being worth 11 million and not being negative. You know what I mean? Not having some sort of growth.
Nobody can ever plan for a massive hit in year 6.
I know.
And we also said the rate of return would be 10% because they're low risk for some reason. But in reality, they wouldn't be. So, and I think this is a crazy story, right? Because it's saying okay, if for whatever reason, 6 years from now, you generated a ton of money, you'd get basically none of that value. Here we have 30 million in additional sales. Really, you'd be worth 5 million. But if you were to generate those sales right off the bat, you see how crazy that is?
Mm-hmm.
So you'd get 15 million as opposed to 11.
11, yeah. No pressure or anything with
for
having a successful anything.
So that's why right. So I notice I only have 10 minutes left.
Yeah, we have 10.
Is that for Q&A, or should I just wrap up quickly?
If we just want to keep going until it's time to go, if you want to keep working on this and letting chat just filter in and they can ask questions, we can do that. Or I think everybody's enjoying watching you do your magic on Excel.
I thought it'd be more fun to have an Excel sheet up and running. So it's like watching a movie a little.
Everybody's focused. I'm focused. That says a lot for me.
Okay. So what I wanted to get across though was the importance was this concept of EV to EBITDA. So I'm just going to repeat it one more time, which is that the present value of each of these cash flows gets summed up into something called the enterprise value. If you divide that enterprise value by your year one EBITDA, that gives you the multiple called EV to EBITDA, which is what everybody references when they talk about M&A and acquisitions. And now I'll take a look at some of the questions that have come through, which I've been ignoring. Brian, yes, you do have to factor in microtransactions, and that's why you would just grow your revenue line, and it would grow your cash flows, and the math would still math. Kevin, is this, oops, what have I done? So Kevin says, is this why we see lots of studios folding a few months after release? No, I think that actually, if you were able to get funded to release, then you're good. Right? Most of the time they fold because they're not able to sustain. They're running the skeleton crew, but the numbers aren't high enough for them to be sustainable. And that's what kills them long term. You know, they look like this. And even if you try to sell to someone, no one's going to buy negative cash flow. That's why even if you have a studio, Embrace or whatever, countless firms are trying to sell their studios. They're trying to sell them for $1. Nobody's buying them because essentially what you're buying is a debt. You have to pay these salaries going forwards. So if people if they don't totally believe in the future of the projects, I'm not going to buy these studios. And how do I prevent this data from being useless when bananas are forever an old meme? I mean, math is timeless, my friend. Any other questions? No?
I think we're good.
What do we do? Do we end with 7 minutes?
No, we'll talk.
We'll talk?
No, we'll talk. We don't end early. I was trying to think of some fun curveballs to throw at you, which is why I was trying to give different examples of like, what if it's bad at first, or what if it's good, or so what if, which I know we don't have a ton of time to go through another write-up and whatnot, but what if there's a ton of hype, you do a bunch of PR, everything in your game is successful, but say there's some negativity within a company or something, and even though it was successful at launch, it then gets boycotted, and you watch just something plummet. How would that change overall? What if they're still trying to mitigate issues? They're kind of breaking even, but they went from having like a super high to barely surviving.
So this is why it's interesting to watch the stock market. Tons of hype before the game is released. Low rate of return, low risk. I pay $55 million for this firm. Starts to have issues, I pay less. Lots of issues, I pay a lot less. Really, really bad, 1/5 of the original value we talked about.
So is it better to sell out?
Well, it's a question we get a lot, and it's hard to answer because people always believe in their projects. But I say yes. And the reason why I say yes is because effectively what you're doing is you're transferring the risk of the outcome to the buyer. So if the game does well, you get a cut of it. You won't get as much as you would have otherwise. But if the game does badly, you got risk off. You got a big chunk of money up front. You got a big chunk of money at 55, and then all of a sudden it was worth 18 or 13. And even if you only got half of it, right? You got 25. Well, today it's only worth 13. And then Kevin, the reason why I haven't included the publisher cut is because it involves something called a waterfall, which is just really annoying to model out, especially live, because I always make mistakes when I do them. But you have to, it's called a waterfall because you pay back Steam, etc. Then you pay back the publisher until they recoup, and then after recoup, you split the money differently. So it's not difficult to do; it's just annoying to do live, and I can't do it in 4 minutes. Maybe I can.
We have faith in you. You're like a little speedy pro.
Yeah, so publisher investment. Well, I mean, I see another question. So maybe since I only have 4 minutes, that might be a better thing to address.
Short example of a very small 3-person team.
Yeah, so I don't know how to pronounce that, but that's actually better for them. Because if you see here, you see a game that sells 50, let's say they sell 200,000 copies. It's a $1 million investment. Because you're only running a 3-person team, this will be 150, and this will be 150. So the value of the investment goes up by $1 million for them without you needing to sell that many more copies. And I think it's reasonable for a 3-person team to sell 200,000 copies. So yeah, for sure. If you can release a game for less people, with less people, then do it. And that's why we're, all of the devs we talk to are like padding their budgets left, right, and center. They're like, okay, we really need 50K, but let's put 65K. And we really need 9 months of runway, but let's put an additional 3 months for this. And they're padding and padding and padding. And there's so much drift that they don't realize they've added another 500K. That 500K may not sound like a lot, but it does swing publisher opinions. So yeah, a 3-person team would do very well for a publisher. I think they'd love that. Okay.
Very insightful. We've never done anything like this before. Actually had live and changing stuff. I liked it. Could current estimated value of game genres on the market help make these numbers accurate?
Could current estimated value of game genres on the market help? Yeah. Like, for example, we use Gamalytics. So if we were to so what we do is we use Gamalytics to look at games we think are similar. And then we look at how many copies they've sold. And then you could do an average or a weighted average. And you have to be honest, don't just pick the best games ever. You pick all of the games that are kind of similar and see how much they sold. And you say, all right, I think we're going to sell about this much. And then you can either use the split, or Gamalytics has a very cool function, which is the curve of sales. And so what we do is we basically recreate the curve of sales, the sales curve, sorry, and use that to estimate how things are going to grow month by month. But yeah, long story short, absolutely the estimated value of game genres helps, especially when you're using comps and you're being very honest with yourself about similar games.
All right. Well, we can go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you so much for your time today, Jack. Guys, thank you for your questions and helping me think of stuff to come up with. Next up, we have our last session of the day for our whole IGB sessions. We're going to have Matt, who's going to be doing their presentation on creating in Japan, grants, communities, and business made simple. So we will be back very soon with Mac. Jack, thank you so much. We do really appreciate you coming on today.
It was a pleasure. Have a great rest of your day.
All right. We'll see you in a bit, chat.
Cheers. Bye.